Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, beyond the reach of the Emperor's light, beyond the reach of any psychic beacon or navigational guide, there sits a fortress that does not want to be found. No psyker has ever sensed it. No demon has ever brushed against its walls in the shifting currents of the warp. No Aeldari farseer has peered along the shimmering threads of fate and found it waiting at the end of any path they dared to walk. It sits in total silence, on a dead moon that orbits no star, surrounded by nothing but cold void. And yet, despite that silence, despite that emptiness, despite the fact that everything about this place radiates the sensation that nothing is there, and nothing has ever been there, and nothing ever will be there, it is one of the most feared locations in the entire galaxy. This is the fortress of the soulless. This is the home of the Culexus temple, and tonight, we're going to talk about them. Welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable. This one is going to take a while, and I want you to be at ease, because the story we're telling is one of the strangest, most quietly unsettling, and most deeply fascinating corners of the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. It's a story about mutation, about rejection, about secret history, about weapons that kill not with blade or bullet, but with absence, with emptiness, with the cold mathematical fact of a soul-shaped hole cut into the fabric of the universe. The Culexus assassins. They are the rarest operatives ever produced by the Officio Assassinorum. They are the most feared thing in existence to any creature that has ever touched the warp. They are, while in a very real sense, the biological inverse of everything that makes psychic life possible. And the Imperium of man, in its infinite pragmatism and its extraordinary capacity for cruelty wrapped in the language of duty, has taken what should be a tragedy and turned it into a weapon. Let's go slowly, because this story deserves care. Part 1. The concept of the void. To understand what makes a Culexus assassin what they are, you first need to understand the warp. And I know, we've talked about the warp before, but stay with me, because the specifics matter here. Every living thing with a mind, with consciousness, with the capacity to think and feel and dream, leaves a trace in the warp, a shadow, an echo. Call it what you want. The Imperium calls it a soul. The Aeldari call it something altogether more intimate and more precious, or because for them the stakes are catastrophically higher. But across every faction, every species, every thinking creature in the galaxy, the principle is the same. The warp reflects the living. It carries the weight of their emotions, their fears, their hopes, their suffering, and their joy. Even ordinary, non-psychic humans, people who have never in their lives manifested a single flicker of psychic ability, still exist in the warp as a gentle shimmer, a warmth, a presence. They are there, in that other place, in that vast ocean of psychic energy that mirrors real space, like a lake mirrors the sky. Small, maybe, barely a candle's worth of light, but present. This is why psychers are what they are, because some people don't just shimmer in the warp. They blaze, they burn like signal fires, but they are lit up so brightly in that other dimension that those energies reach back through the barrier between worlds and express themselves in reality as psychic power. Telekinesis, precognition, the ability to hurl bolts of raw warp energy at a target, the ability to speak mind to mind across millions of miles of vacuum. All of it flows from that deep connection, that thread stretching from the physical body of the psyker down into the roiling depths of the immaterium. Now imagine, for a moment, that the connection simply isn't there. Imagine a person who, when viewed through psychic sight, doesn't shimmer or blaze or glow at all, doesn't flicker with even the faintest suggestion of warmth. Imagine that where all other living things appear as light, this person appears as the absence of light, not darkness. Because darkness is just space waiting to be filled. Something worse than that. A hole. A shape cut into the fabric of psychic reality with the precise outline of a human being, and behind that outline, nothing. Absolute zero. A vacuum that doesn't just fail to contribute energy to the warp, but actively, hungrily draws the psychic energy out of everything around it, like a drain. This is what a blank is. This is what a null is. This is what the Imperium in its various ancient texts and official records calls a pariah. And this is the raw material from which every Culexus assassin is made. The sensation of being near one of these individuals, even for a baseline human with no psychic ability at all, is profoundly and indefinably wrong. People describe it differently, because the experience seems to interact with whatever anxieties already live in a person's mind. Some people feel sudden, sourceless dread, as if they have just remembered some terrible thing that hasn't happened yet. Some people feel inexplicable revulsion, a physical disgust with no object, the way you might feel if you walked into a room where something has been dead for a while, but you can't see or smell it yet. Some people feel loneliness, sharp and specific loneliness, arriving with the force of grief. And some people feel nothing they can name at all, only the bone-deep conviction that the person standing next to them isn't quite a person, that something is missing from them that should be there, and that the worst thing imaginable would be to find out what that something is. For ordinary people, this sensation is uncomfortable, unpleasant, enough to make them keep their distance, to find excuses not to share a table or walk the same corridor. Enough, over time, to make the blank an outcast. A figure of instinctive, irrational hatred that no one can fully explain and no one particularly wants to examine. For psychers, the experience is something else entirely. For a psyker who perceives reality partly through the lens of warp sight, a blank in close proximity is like staring through a telescope at what should be a star, only to find an absence, a wound in the sky. That void doesn't just make the psyker uncomfortable, it pulls at them. It reaches into the connection between their mind and the warp and starts hauling at it, trying to drag the psychic energy away from the psyker and down into itself. But weak psychers begin to lose the ability to access their powers the moment a blank enters the room. Stronger psychers feel their abilities diminishing, faltering, guttering like candles in a hard wind. And the closest, most powerful blanks, the ones rated at the deepest end of what the Imperium's Adeptus Astra Telepathica calls the Omega- level of the psychic scale, the ones who end up in the Culexus temple, can cause physical agony in nearby psychers simply by existing, can drain them, can kill them by proximity alone. And for demons, those entities of pure psychic matter given form and will within the warp, a blank is nearly invisible. Because the way a demon perceives the physical world is primarily through the warp's reflections of it. They sense the warm light of souls the way a predator senses heat, and a blank has no heat. No light, no soul signature, no reflection. To a demon, a blank approaching is like trying to see the shape of a void. You can see the outline of it in what it disrupts. You can sense the wrongness of its presence, but you cannot target it, cannot focus on it, cannot bring the full weight of your nature to bear against something that your nature has no way to perceive. In the most extreme cases, powerful blanks are entirely invisible to demonic senses, completely undetectable, as if they simply are not there. Think about what all of this means as a military tool. Think about what the Imperium of man, with its endless wars against psyker-heavy enemies, its constant struggles against chaos sorcerers and Aeldari warlocks, and the eldritch nightmares of the warp-given physical form, could do with someone who is immune to psychic powers. Invisible to daemons, terrifying to psychers, and capable of draining the warp connection right out of a target before killing them with a touch. Think about that, and then take it further. Think about the specific, deeply personal nature of the terror a blank inspires in a psyker. Because it is worth dwelling on, because it explains so much of what makes the Culexus assassin such a psychologically devastating weapon, rather than simply a physically dangerous one. A psyker's power is not just a talent they have, It is a fundamental part of how they experience reality. When a psyker looks at the world, they don't just see with their eyes. They perceive the warp's reflection of it simultaneously, the way a person both hears and lip reads at the same time, each sense reinforcing the other into a complete picture. They feel the emotions of people around them as ambient pressure, like temperature. They sense approaching violence as a disturbance in the subtle currents of psychic energy that run through everything. They communicate through dimensions you and I cannot access. They navigate by landmarks that exist only in the Imperium. Their power is not something they pick up and put down. It is woven into their perception. It is how they understand themselves to be real. Now put a blank in the room. Feel the way every single one of those perceptions begins to fail. The warp vision goes dark. The ambient emotional sense goes quiet. The subtle currents that normally carry so much information simply stop. And in their place, the void, the pull of the absence, a reaching in and trying to drain away the connection to the warp that has been part of the psyker's identity since they first manifested. The power that has defined them, protected them, elevated them above the ordinary, threatened now not by something stronger, but by something that has no strength at all, something that doesn't fight, something that simply drains, passively, effortlessly, the way a black hole pulls without reaching. There is something uniquely horrifying about being threatened by a quality's absence rather than its presence. Most forms of combat, most forms of threat can be understood, can be measured, can be opposed with enough will and preparation and skill. The enemy psyker shooting lightning can be dodged. The enemy sorcerer summoning demons can be banished if your own abilities are strong enough. Sure, there is a grammar to psychic warfare, a language of power against power, will against will, presence against presence. The blank doesn't speak that language. The blank isn't there in the part of reality where that language is spoken. And so the psyker's entire training, their years of careful development, their hard-won mastery of techniques that took decades to refine, all of it is simply inapplicable. They have been made to bring a weapon to a fight where the opponent has no body for the weapon to strike. This is why Aeldari warlocks, those ancient and powerful warrior seers who have fought against some of the most terrible things in the galaxy, have been recorded describing Culexus assassins as nothing short of the embodiments of pure evil. Not strategic threats, not tactical problems, evil. A word that for the Aeldari carries immense weight. A word they rarely apply to anything they simply dislike or find dangerous. A word that speaks to something more fundamental than injury or death. They call the Culexus evil because the Culexus represents the negation of everything they are, the reversal of the quality that makes them what they are. And to be negated, in the context of Aeldari philosophy, is something worse than being killed. To be negated is to be told that your existence was never quite as real as you thought. And then understand that the Culexus assassins are not just any blanks. They are the very rarest of the rare, the deepest end of the scale, the ones born with the pariah gene expressed so completely, so intensely, so fully, that every other ability, every other advantage a Culexus operative brings to the field, ours is built on top of that foundational void, that emptiness, that absence. They are, in the truest sense of the word, made of nothing. And nothing, in the right circumstances, is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Part 2. The pariah gene. A mutation beyond understanding. Let's talk about the science, or at least what passes for science in the 41st millennium. The pariah gene. That's what the Imperium calls it. The genetic mutation that produces a blank, that creates this anti-psychic presence, this wound in the warp fabric. It is, by every measure, the rarest human genetic trait known to exist. The Lexicanum, that vast repository of imperial knowledge, estimates that the gene manifests in approximately 1 individual per billion people, sometimes fewer. There are worlds with populations in the tens of billions where not a single blank has been born in recorded history. There are entire star systems that have gone centuries without producing one. You could walk across the breadth of the Imperium's territory, a dominion spanning hundreds of thousands of worlds, and the total number of living blanks at any given moment would still be vanishingly small. A handful compared to the uncountable trillions of ordinary human beings going about their lives. A handful compared to even the already rare sanctioned psychers who serve in the Astronomican choir or fight alongside Imperial forces. 1 in a billion. Let that settle. And then understand that even among those, the vast majority are killed before anyone who might recruit them can find them. Because that aura of wrongness, that instinctive revulsion that blanks inspire in everyone around them, doesn't wait for the child to grow up and understand what they are. It is there from birth, possibly before. Accounts from families who have raised blanks describe the experience in heartbreaking terms, though those accounts are rare because the Imperium doesn't often feel the need to document heartbreak when practical considerations are available. Parents who feel, without being able to explain why, that something about their infant is wrong. Siblings who refuse to play near the child. Communities where the child is kept at arm's length, where adults find elaborate reasons to avoid the family home, where something like a social quarantine forms naturally around a being that has done nothing to deserve it, except be born different. On more primitive worlds, or more zealous ones, this quarantine doesn't stay social. On worlds where psychers are hunted and mutants are executed, a child radiating this kind of wrongness rarely survives long enough to be recruited. The origin of the pariah gene is, even by 40,000 standards, a genuinely contested mystery. Several explanations have been offered across the millennia of Imperial history, and the truth is that none of them are confirmed. One older theory, sourced from fragmentary records of the ancient Necron dynasties, suggests that the gene was not a natural human mutation at all, but a deliberate introduction. That the ancient Necrons, specifically the vast intelligences known as the Citan, those star gods who predate human civilization by billions of years, deliberately introduced this trait into human genetics during the Dark Age of technology as part of their eternal war against the warp and everything that uses it. The Necrons have no soul presence themselves. They exist entirely outside the warp, which is one of the reasons chaos cannot corrupt them, and demons find their metal bodies deeply uncomfortable to possess. The logic of the old theory goes that creating soulless humans served the Necrons' interests in some long game played out across geological time. Creating tools, perhaps, disrupting the psychic potential of their enemies, introducing chaos into the great powers that would one day inherit the galaxy. This theory has largely fallen out of favor in more recent sources, or at least its details have been reconsidered, but it casts a long shadow. Because the fact remains that there is a documented relationship between blanks and Necrons. The Necron process of creating their warrior caste servants, known as pariahs, those horrifying amalgams of living blank gene humans fused with necrodermis and forcibly robbed of everything that made them who they were. That process was real. And it is a process that specifically required humans with the pariah gene. The Necrons knew what blanks were. They knew how to find them and how to use them. Whether that means the Necrons created the pariah gene in the first place, or simply discovered and exploited something that had arisen naturally, is a question the Imperium has never conclusively answered. And given that the relevant research apparently ended in disaster during the early Great Crusade, prompting the Emperor himself to place a moratorium on investigations into the gene's source, it is a question that may never be answered. The Emperor had reasons to stop that research. What those reasons were has never been made public. A second and more recent theory suggests the gene arose as a natural evolutionary adaptation. That as psychic ability began manifesting more frequently in human populations, perhaps accelerated by the spiritual turmoil that eventually culminated in the birth of Slaanesh and the corruption of the warp, some rare humans developed the opposite trait. An immune response of a sort. Humanity covering its bases across the probability distribution of mutation, producing individuals who were completely invulnerable to the dangers of warp exposure at the cost of everything that gives psychic life its warmth. There's something quietly sad about that theory, if you sit with it. The idea that blanks are nature's hedge against the warp. Protection for the species, yes, but protection that comes at a personal cost, so severe that most of the individuals bearing it are killed or driven to isolation before anyone even knows they exist. What is confirmed, regardless of origin, is that the gene is inheritable. A blank parent has a higher chance than average of producing a blank child, though even then the probability is still very low. The gene does not breed true in any straightforward way. It arises unpredictably, in family lines that may have shown no sign of it for generations, and vanishes just as suddenly. The Culexus temple and its predecessor clade have spent centuries attempting to understand this pattern, and attempting to increase the predictability of blank births through whatever means are available to an institution with access to the best genetic science the Adeptus Mechanicus has to offer. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of the Culexus temple's existence. If the pariah gene manifests in 1 per billion, and the galaxy-spanning Imperium contains trillions of humans across hundreds of thousands of worlds, then in absolute numbers, blanks should be born in the thousands per year across the entire Imperium. But the vast majority are killed in childhood. Many more are claimed by the Sisters of Silence, who have their own recruitment network and their own purposes for blanks, one that predates the Culexus temple itself. The Inquisition claims others. Individual inquisitors prize blanks highly as acolytes, now using them as living shields against psychic attack and as weapons against demon-infected targets. So what trickles down to the Culexus temple after all these competing claims, after all the deaths and the recruitment losses, is a very, very small number. Small enough that the temple has resorted to extraordinary measures to supplement its intake. Specifically, cloning. VAT-grown blanks created in laboratories, their genomes engineered to carry the pariah gene in full expression. The process is extraordinarily difficult, requires immense resources, and produces only a handful of viable candidates per year, even under ideal conditions. But it is real. It happens. And it is, in some ways, the strangest thing about the Culexus temple. This detail that gets glossed over in most discussions of their lore. Because when you vat grow a human being specifically to carry a trait that will make them a pariah among their own kind, when you create a person whose entire reason for existing is to be used as a weapon, and when the nature of that trait means they may genuinely struggle to feel the kinds of emotional bonds that most people take for granted, you have created something that sits at a very uncomfortable intersection of ethics and military necessity. But ethics, as I'm sure you've noticed, has never been the Imperium's strongest suit. Part 3. Life before the temple. Outcasts among humanity. Before we get to the temple itself, before we talk about training and weapons and the mechanics of assassination, I want to spend time with what a blank's life actually looks like before they are recruited. Because this context matters. It shapes everything about what the Culexus assassins are and why they are the way they are. Picture a child born on an average Imperial hive world. Tens of billions of people crammed into habstacks, rising kilometers into a toxic sky. The community is tight because it has to be. People live on top of each other, share corridors and water recyclers and air processors. The social fabric is dense and immediate. Your neighbors know your face, know your name, know your family. And there is something about the new child down the corridor that everyone knows, though no one can quite say why, that makes them not want to look too long, not want to stand too close, not want to have their children play with this particular child. The child hasn't done anything wrong. They don't know why people avoid them. They learn, early, that there is something about them that pushes the world away. That when they walk into a room, the ambient noise diminishes slightly, conversations trail off, eyes drift elsewhere. That their parents' friends stop coming over. That their siblings, over time, spend less and less time in the same space. That even their parents, who love them as best they can, seem unable to sustain closeness for long. There is a kind of grief in this, that most blanks carry for the rest of their lives, or what their lives would be if they were not found by the temple. The grief of knowing that your presence is itself a form of harm to the people you love. That the most loving thing you can do for anyone is stay away from them. On more tolerant worlds, this might resolve into a relatively quiet life of solitude. And blanks who survive into adulthood often do so by placing themselves at the margins of human habitation. The wilderness, the uninhabited outer reaches, jobs that require minimal human contact, that take them away from the dense psychic warmth of crowded cities into places where the quiet of their own nature is less likely to create suffering in those around them. Some accounts suggest that blanks who live this way become extraordinarily perceptive in physical, non-psychic ways. Their senses are tuned to the material world with unusual sharpness precisely because the psychic layer of reality is invisible to them. They become, in a strange way, hypermaterial, entirely anchored in the physical, extraordinarily good at reading body language, at noticing environmental details, and at surviving without the psychic ambient that most living things rely on to some degree without ever being aware of it. But on less tolerant worlds, the prognosis is far darker. And it must be said that the Imperium of man, this civilization built on the worship of a psyker emperor and the paranoid regulation of psychic ability, is not, on balance, a tolerant civilization when it comes to mutation. The same black ships that comb the Imperium's worlds for unsanctioned psychers, those vast and terrible vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that harvest human psychic potential to feed the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon, these ships also keep records of blanks. Not because the black ships themselves employ them in great numbers, but because the multiple organizations that prize blanks have their own networks, their own watchers, their own informants scattered through the populations of every inhabited world. When a blank is identified, the information travels, and depending on who gets to them first, their fate could go in many directions. The luckiest ones are reached by the Culexus temple. I say lucky with some irony, because the life of a Culexus assassin is not what most people would call a good life, but it is at minimum a purposeful one. The temple offers something that most blanks have never had: a place, a function, others of their kind. The knowledge that the thing about them which has caused so much suffering is not a flaw, but a quality. A rare and terrible quality, yes, but one that is valued, one that is needed. Consider what that means for someone who has spent their entire life being actively avoided by every living thing they encounter. The Culexus Temple is, for many of its recruits, the first place in the universe where they have ever been wanted. The ones claimed by the Inquisition have varied experiences depending entirely on the temperament of the Inquisitor in question. Some are treated well, genuinely prized and protected, given roles that take advantage of their abilities without requiring them to be placed in mortal danger on a daily basis. Others are treated as tools, maintained in the functional minimum of health, and utilized until they are no longer viable. The historical record is not comforting on this point. The Sisters of Silence, that ancient order of militant blanks who served the Emperor during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, and have since returned to service following the Cicatrix Maledictum, their experience is its own complex story. They are, in many ways, a mirror of the Culexus Temple. All female, all blanks. Warriors trained for specific anti-psychic operations. But where the Culexus operate alone, in darkness, as assassins, the Sisters of Silence move in formations, in the open, as a shock force. Their history with the temple is ancient and complicated, and we'll touch on it more when we discuss origins. And then, there are the ones who are not found in time, the ones killed in childhood as mutants, the ones who live and die in lonely obscurity, never knowing what they were, the ones whose blank aura becomes too much for their communities, who are driven out, who die in the wilderness or the void lanes or the lower depths of hive cities, where strange people sometimes disappear without anyone particularly noticing. These are the ones the records don't carry. Because the records were never made. History only documents the useful. There is a specific cruelty in the geography of a blank's life that deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of the Culexus law. Because the social rejection that blanks experience is not rational. It is not based on anything the blank has done. It is an involuntary biological response, a feature of living things with soul presence instinctively flinching away from something that has none. The people who reject a blank child, who feel uneasy around them, who manufacture reasons to avoid them, these people are not villains in a meaningful moral sense. They are responding to something their nervous systems are telling them, in the part of the brain that processes psychic sensation, even in people who don't know they're doing it. The blank makes them feel wrong, and so they pull away. And the blank, who has not chosen to make them feel this way, who would give anything to be able to walk into a room without causing that involuntary retreat in everyone around them, learns the lesson that their presence is itself a kind of harm. This is the first and most defining wound in a blank's psychology. Not violence, not active persecution, though those come often enough, but exclusion. The specific, daily exclusion of being the one person in every room that everyone else has unconsciously decided not to fully include. The person at the edge of the circle, the one whose jokes don't land, not because they're unfunny, but because the slight discomfort of listening to them makes people want to move on quickly. The one who always sits alone at meals. It's not because anyone decided to exclude them, but because choosing to sit next to them requires overcoming a subtle but persistent resistance that no one can explain and most people don't even notice they're feeling. On some worlds, this resolves into a more explicit rejection. The backwards worlds, the deeply superstitious ones, the ones where the lack of a warp echo might be interpreted through local mythology as the absence of a spirit or the presence of a curse. There are hive worlds where children born without the subtle warmth of a soul presence are left exposed. There are feudal worlds where they are called spirit empty, where the local faith holds that something about them is fundamentally unclean, where the community comes together in the specific medieval way that communities deal with that which they fear and don't understand. Yes, and there are even more civilized worlds where the simple social exclusion is just as effectively fatal, where a child who grows up unable to form connections, unable to be taken in by anyone, who lives entirely at the margins of a society that cannot bring itself to fully include them, eventually stops surviving through sheer statistical pressure. No one specifically killed them. The world just didn't make room. The only places where blanks are sometimes valued before the temple finds them are, ironically, places where things of the warp are already a pressing and immediate problem. Frontier worlds near the Eye of Terror, or the Cicatrix Maledictum in the more recent era, where demon incursions and psychic corruption are facts of daily life, sometimes develop an awareness of what a blank can provide, but where the local population has learned by painful experience that certain rare individuals seem to push back against the warp's incursions, that a null aura can hold a demonic presence at bay, that having one of these uncomfortable, strange, avoided people around might actually be worth the discomfort. On these worlds, blanks sometimes find something approaching acceptance, a role, not warmth, not friendship in the way most people experience it, but utility, and utility is a form of belonging. The Sisters of Silence understand this, in their own institutional way. Their entire order is built on the principle that what the blank is can be a source of strength and purpose, rather than simply isolation. The all-female warrior order that has served the emperor since before the Horus heresy, who stood beside the custodes at the gates of the imperial palace, who helped bind the dark powers during the heresy's worst moments, they were born from the same raw material as the Culexus, the same gene, the same childhood of rejection, and they built from it something that stood beside Primarchs. The Culexus temple builds something different, something smaller, something quieter, but no less significant in its way, because it tells you something important about the Culexus temple and the Imperium that created it. The pariah gene is real. Blanks exist throughout human space. being born and dying with quiet tragedy in numbers that, while small by planetary standards, add up over the vast canvas of the Imperium. Most of them never become anything. Most of them just live and suffer and die. Their extraordinary nature either killing them or grinding them down into solitude. The ones who survive to be recruited, who are shaped and trained into something the Imperium can point at its enemies, they are a tiny fraction. The glittering tip of a very large and very dark iceberg. And yet from that tiny fraction, the Temple has produced, across 10,000 years of history, operatives who have killed targets that armies could not reach, assassins who have walked through demon legions undetected, hunters who have brought down Aeldari farseers and chaos sorcerers and warp entities of such power that even other imperial assassin temples could not approach them. The rarest of the rare, built from the discarded and the feared, turned into something that makes even the most powerful psychic forces in the galaxy hesitate. There's something both inspiring and deeply troubling about that, which, if you've spent any time thinking about the Imperium, probably sounds familiar. Part 4. Origins of the Culexus Temple. The secret beneath the secret. The Officio Assassinorum is one of the oldest institutions in the Imperium, created during the Great Crusade, when Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted servant and the first Grand Master of Assassins, gathered 6 individuals on the slopes of Mount Vengeance on Terra and bound them with oaths no one else was meant to know about. Each of these 6 directors, Primus, represented a distinct philosophy of killing, a distinct method, a distinct school of death refined to its highest possible expression. Their names were kept secret even from each other. Their faces were hidden even at that first meeting. But the oaths they swore were real, and the organizations they built from those oaths have endured for 10,000 years. The Culexus Clade, as it was originally called, was founded by the individual known only as Sire Culexus. Everything about this person is shrouded in the same secrecy that defines the institution they built. Their gender, their origin world, their personal history before the founding, all of it lost. What we know is that Sire Culexus possessed the pariah gene, that they were themselves a blank, that they were, presumably, one of the rare individuals who had survived childhood, survived the instinctive rejection of everyone around them, and arrived at a position where Malcador could see in them the foundation of something new, a new way to kill, a new instrument of the Emperor's will. The name Culexus itself is something worth noting. It derives from the Latin word culex, meaning mosquito. There is something darkly poetic about that etymology. A mosquito doesn't fight you directly. It doesn't overpower you or outrun you. It approaches in silence, unnoticed, settles on you without your awareness, and takes something vital from you. It feeds on what makes you alive, and then it's gone. And maybe you never knew it was there until it's too late. That's the Culexus Temple. That's the philosophy encoded in its very name. A mosquito that drinks not blood, but warp energy, that drains not just the body, but the psychic life force itself. But the founding of the Culexus Clade was not straightforward, because before it could be established, there was a political problem that needed to be solved. And this problem reveals something important about the Imperium's early relationship with blanks. When the Sisters of Silence, during the Great Crusade, began capturing and transporting blanks back to Terra in large numbers, something unexpected happened. The gathered blanks, their anti-psychic auras combining and reinforcing each other, began to cast a shadow in the warp, a cold spot, a region of psychic dead space that extended outward from the concentrations of blanks, and, at its worst, began to interfere with the Astronomicon itself. The Astronomicon, that vast psychic beacon, powered by hundreds of sacrificed psychers and guided by the will of the Emperor, the thing that makes faster-than-light navigation possible across Imperial space. The thing the entire military and economic structure of the Imperium depends on. As the Council of Terra noticed, high-ranking officials in that body Alarmed by both the interference with the Astronomicon and by the more general unease that large numbers of blanks created among the psychically sensitive population of Terra.
Okay, real talk for a second, and I mean genuinely, just me talking to you. The Culexus is probably my personal favorite of all the assassin temples, and I've thought about why a lot. It's not the coolest looking, it's not the most cinematic. The adversary is doing backflips through walls while on 17 types of combat stimulants. The Vindicator is shooting people through solid objects from 3 kilometers away. Those are objectively more dramatic. But the Culexus just sits differently with me, because every other assassin is extraordinary as something. The Culexus is just extraordinary at the absence of something. And I think there's something quietly profound in that. This idea that the void itself, the emptiness, the thing the galaxy has spent millennia trying to fill with warp energy and souls and psychic connection, that void is actually the most dangerous thing in existence when you put it in the right place at the right time. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Began agitating for action. Their proposed solution was straightforward, in the way that all brutal Imperial solutions are straightforward. Exterminate the blanks. All of them. Declare them mutants, as dangerous in their own way as rogue psychers, and have the Sisters of Silence deal with them the same way they dealt with unsanctioned psychic phenomena. The Emperor never made an official decree on this. Perhaps he was already too deeply occupied with whatever he was building in the dungeons of the Imperial Palace. Perhaps he recognized the value in what the blanks represented and chose not to intervene directly. What happened instead was a display of the kind of quiet political genius that Malcador the Sigillite had in abundance. The Mechanicum announced, with all appropriate ceremony, that the Pariah project was being ended, that the laboratories studying blanks were being shut down, that the specimens were being executed, the research archived, the whole unfortunate experiment closed. There were official records. There was documentation. There was, presumably, public satisfaction among the more zealous members of the council. What there was not, it turned out, was accuracy. Because the number of blank executions documented in those official records did not match the actual number of blanks held in Mechanicum facilities, while the math simply didn't add up for anyone who bothered to check, which, at the time, apparently nobody in the Council of Terra did. What had actually happened was that the most promising blanks, the deepest expressions of the pariah gene, the ones whose anti-psychic aura was most powerful and most fully expressed, had been quietly transferred. Moved to a secure facility somewhere on Terra, operating outside the knowledge of the Council, out of reach of the Sisters of Silence and the more zealous branches of early Imperial bureaucracy. And in that facility, overseen by the Mechanicum and guided by Malcador's vision, the Culexus clade was born. Sire Culexus took the raw material of those rescued blanks and began building. Training regimens were developed, equipment was designed, methods were refined for finding candidates in the wild, for harvesting them from the populations of worlds across the growing Imperium, for screening them and preparing them and transforming them from isolated, traumatized individuals who had spent their lives being rejected by everyone around them into something controlled, lethal, and purposeful. The name the facility would eventually be given, once the clade evolved into a full temple after the Horus heresy, tells you everything about the experience of living there. The Fortress of the Soulless, a name that is simultaneously an accurate physical descriptor and an acknowledgement of what every person within its walls is. Not cruel, perhaps, not meant as an insult, just honest, in the blunt, unsentimental way that the Imperium often is when it runs out of euphemisms. This is a fortress. And it is full of people who have no souls in the sense that the warp understands. What else would you call it? The Culexus clade served throughout the rest of the Great Crusade and the Horus heresy, and its operatives participated in the desperate struggle to hold the Imperium together during those darkest years. After the heresy, the clade was formalized, given its current structure and name, and incorporated into the rebuilt Officio Assassinorum. It was at this point that the title shifted from clade to temple, from an experimental organization to an established institution. The temple's location has shifted over the millennia. Originally, the facility on Terra was the heart of operations. but after the Wars of Vindication in the 36th Millennium, when the various assassin temples were required to separate to prevent the concentration of power that had led to so much disaster, the Culexus temple relocated. Today, its home is that dead moon I described at the beginning, outside the Astronomican's reach, in a region of space so far from any inhabited system that finding it requires knowing exactly where it is, a place that a navigator cannot guide a ship to on instinct, a place that sits beyond the light that the Imperium's psychic beacon casts. This isn't a coincidence. This is deliberately chosen, and it makes a dark kind of sense. The Culexus temple doesn't belong in the warm, lit regions of the Imperium. It belongs at the edges of things, in the cold, in the dark, where nothing that has a soul feels comfortable lingering. At Part 5, the Fortress of the Soulless, a place beyond the light. Let us describe it as best we can from the fragments the Imperium's records have seen fit to preserve. The dead moon on which the fortress sits orbits no star. This is not a planet in some remote system that simply hasn't been settled yet. This is a body that drifts through interstellar space without any primary star to orbit. A rogue body in the truest sense, moving through the darkness on a long, slow path that carries it through the outskirts of several star systems over the course of centuries without ever belonging to any of them. The surface is airless and cold, the kind of cold that makes absolute zero seem like an ambition rather than a measurement. There is no atmosphere, no geological activity, no light except the distant gleam of stars too far away to provide meaningful illumination. The fortress itself is built into the moon's crust, armor-plated and sealed against the void, a vast underground complex of corridors and training chambers and equipment vaults and dormitories. If you were somehow able to stand on the surface and look out at the stars, the absence of any nearby sun would mean that the sky above you showed the full blazing spread of the galaxy, unobscured by atmospheric interference, more stars visible than a person from an inhabited world ever sees. Beautiful in a completely inhuman way, gorgeous in its totality and absolute silence. Inside, the fortress is described in the few accounts that have been made available as echoing. The sound of footsteps carries in ways that seem slightly wrong. It's as if the acoustics of the place have been shaped by the absence of any psychic background noise. Normally, living beings unconsciously perceive a kind of low-level psychic hum around other people, a subliminal awareness that other souls are present, that the air is inhabited. In the Fortress of the Soulless, that hum is absent. The air is populated by bodies without souls, human shapes that move and breathe and presumably speak, and yet register as empty space in the part of the mind that looks for other minds. The people who can enter the fortress and function there, the senior officials of the Officio Assassinorum, who directly administer the Culexus temple, the logistics personnel, the engineers who maintain the facility's systems, must be selected specifically for their ability to endure this environment without breaking down. And even they, selected and prepared, reportedly find the experience profoundly uncomfortable. There is a sensation described in various accounts as dread that settles on non-blanks who enter the fortress within the first few hours and never entirely lifts. Not fear, specifically. Not the targeted anxiety that comes from facing a specific danger. Just dread. Dread as an ambient condition, a background radiation of wrongness that has no source and no resolution. Just is. For the Culexus assassins themselves, this is home. And the interesting, quietly heartbreaking element of this is that the fortress may be the only place in the galaxy where a blank is truly comfortable, where their anti-psychic presence doesn't create discomfort in those around them, because everyone around them shares that presence. Where the social fabric can form at all, in some attenuated way, because the instinctive rejection that blanks provoke in non-blanks is absent. There is a community there, of a kind. A fellowship, strange and limited, and built on a foundation of shared isolation, but real. The Culexus assassins know each other. They have what might be called relationships. Whether those relationships involve the full range of human emotion is a question the Lexicanum handles carefully, noting that vat-grown Culexus operatives in particular may struggle with social interaction, capable of mimicking predictive human behavior, but possibly not experiencing it fully. That detail deserves a pause. The vat-grown ones, those who are not born to biological parents but created in laboratory conditions specifically for this purpose, grow up inside the fortress with no prior experience of the outside world, no family except the institutional kind, no community except the one built from other blanks. Their understanding of human emotion is learned analytically, studied the way you might study a language that isn't native to you, absorbed through observation and pattern recognition rather than felt. They can identify happiness and grief and anger from body language and context. They can mirror appropriate emotional responses in social situations when the mission requires it. But whether they genuinely feel these things, whether there is an interior life behind the learned behaviors, is something the records leave deliberately ambiguous. All Culexus assassins, whether naturally born or vat-grown, remain within the fortress unless they are on active duty. This is not optional. This is a structural requirement of the temple. The risks of allowing operational blanks to move freely in the wider Imperium without supervision, without the containment protocols the temple provides, are considered too great. The effect of a trained Culexus operative walking uncontrolled through a densely populated city, through an Astra Telepathica facility, through any of the psychic infrastructure that underpins Imperial civilization, would be disruptive at minimum and catastrophic at worst. So, they are kept in, and the fortress becomes their entire world when they are not actively killing for the Imperium. There is a custodian system. Each Culexus assassin on active deployment is accompanied by a custodian, a senior official of the Officio Assassinorum who operates certain aspects of the assassin's equipment, as specifically the animus speculum, and who serves as something between a handler, a warden, and, as the sources describe it, a keeper. The custodian ensures that the assassin remains under control, that their mission parameters are followed, that the destructive potential they represent is directed precisely where it needs to be and nowhere else. The relationship between an assassin and their custodian is described as complex, significant, and typically the closest thing to human connection that either party has for the duration of the operation. What happens to Culexus assassins who grow old, who are injured beyond recovery, who outlive their operational usefulness? The records are silent. The Imperium does not tend to publish detailed retirement plans for its weapons. As Part 6, Training and Transformation, the making of an anathema, if you survive childhood as a blank, if you survive long enough to be found by the temple's recruitment network, the real ordeal is only just beginning. Because what the Culexus temple does to its recruits is a transformation. And like most imperial transformations, it involves significant suffering as a normal cost of the process. All Officio Assassinorum recruits, regardless of which temple they are destined for, undergo an initial phase of assessment and basic training that is designed to eliminate a substantial portion of the intake immediately. The Assassinorum does not waste resources on individuals who are not going to survive the rigors of active operations. The Vindicar Temple demands physical and neurological perfection in their sniper operatives. The Eversaw Temple's drug regimens are designed to destroy those who don't have the precise biochemical profile to survive them. The Calidus Temple requires a personality structure capable of sustaining deep, false identities for years at a time without losing its grip on reality. All of these are demanding. All of them are lethal to those who fail. The Culexus Temple's selection criteria are somewhat different because the fundamental quality required, the pariah gene, either you have it at full expression or you don't. There is no training that gives you the pariah gene. There is no mental discipline that makes a non-blank into a blank. The filter at the Culexus temple is not primarily about finding who has the talent, because the talent was identified before recruitment. And it is about finding who can be made into something that can function under the extreme pressures of deep cover assassination operations, despite the psychological and social challenges that every blank carries. Physical augmentation comes first, or at least early. Culexus assassins receive biological implants designed to enhance their already considerable physical capabilities. Reaction speeds are pushed to the absolute edge of what human neural architecture can support. Agility and mobility are refined to an almost supernatural degree. The accounts of trained Culexus assassins in motion describe something that reads more like a force of nature than a person, something that flows through obstacles rather than around them, that occupies space with a different geometry than normal bodies do. This makes a certain intuitive sense. A Culexus assassin needs to get close to a target, close enough that their null aura can do its work, close enough for the final lethal moment, and they need to do this without being noticed, which means moving with perfect silence, perfect economy, perfect patience. Then there is the more difficult work, the psychological conditioning, the development of what might be called aura control. Because here is an interesting aspect of blank abilities that doesn't always get sufficient attention. A blank's anti-psychic aura is not, by default, under conscious control. It simply radiates, constantly, in all directions. This is fine for certain purposes. If you want a bodyguard who makes nearby psychers uncomfortable, you want someone whose aura is always on. But if you want an assassin, someone who needs to infiltrate a target location, blend into a crowd, approach their quarry without triggering alarm, you need an operative who can modulate that aura, who can, in some sense, quiet themselves, pull the void inward, make the wrongness less noticeable, at least to the non-psychic senses, while retaining the ability to unleash it fully at the precise moment of the kill. Culexus operatives are trained to do exactly this, through methods that are not fully documented, presumably because the Culexus temple has no interest in anyone outside understanding their training methodology. The assassins develop the ability to partially suppress their own null aura on a voluntary basis. Not entirely. The aura is always there at some level, always radiating that faint wrongness that makes non-psychics uncomfortable. But they can reduce its intensity, at least at range. They can approach, as they can pass through a guarded location, brushing past soldiers and servants and attendants, and those people will feel vaguely unsettled but will not be able to articulate why, will not call out or raise alarm, will simply feel their eyes slide away from the figure passing them, their attention moving to something else, their minds quietly and instinctively choosing not to process what they are seeing. And then, when the moment comes, the Culexus opens up. The animus speculum, that distinctive and terrible helmet that all Culexus operatives wear, has its own active components that we will discuss shortly. But the core of what happens when a Culexus assassin engages a target is a deliberate expansion of their natural aura, amplified and directed through their equipment, aimed at the specific psychic signatures they have been trained to recognize. The full weight of the void, focused, concentrated, weaponized. For a psyker in proximity when this happens, the experience is not a clean death. It is a stripping. The psychic energy is pulled out of them, the connection to the warp severed, the powers they have spent years or decades developing suddenly silent in their minds. And where those powers existed, there is now the blank's void, reaching in, and it is cold. It is the coldest thing a psyker can experience, colder than physical cold. The absence of warmth in the place where their entire sense of self was rooted. The training program also encompasses everything you would expect of any elite assassin. Stealth, combat, particularly close quarters work. As because a Culexus assassin does not rely on firearms in the conventional sense. Infiltration techniques, target analysis, mission planning, counter-interrogation protocols, the manipulation of non-psychic security systems. The Culexus assassin who enters a well-guarded facility is not doing so as a one-trick weapon. They bring the full toolkit of a highly trained operative, and the null aura is the final piece of the puzzle, rather than the whole of their capability. One additional element of training deserves specific mention, because it speaks to something remarkable about the temple's methods. Culexus operatives are taught to master what might be called the art of being perceived, because their natural tendency is to be not perceived, to have attention slide away from them, to be the anomaly that the mind refuses to acknowledge. A fully trained Culexus can choose the degree to which they register in other people's awareness. In a crowd, invisible. In a guarded room, present but unremarkable. In a moment of maximum impact, terrifyingly, overwhelmingly real, a sudden presence that the mind cannot deny. The Culexus Temple calls this, in their internal records, the difference between being a void and wielding one. The void does not choose. The assassin does. There is also a physical and neurological integration process that happens in the later stages of training, one that merges the operative's conscious control more deeply with the equipment they carry. The animus speculum is not simply a helmet that you put on and take off. Over months and years of conditioning, the operative develops a relationship with it that is closer to extension than use. On the modulation of the contra-psychic dampers becomes as natural as breathing. The sense of the force matrix's charge level becomes an ambient awareness, like knowing how hungry you are without having to stop and consciously assess. The activation of the discharge function, the opening of that great cyclopean eye in the faceplate, becomes a choice that requires less and less deliberate effort over time, more and more an expression of will that the equipment simply follows. This integration is also why the loss of a Culexus operative in the field is such a serious waste of resources. The equipment they carry is extraordinarily rare and difficult to manufacture. The training is years in the making. But perhaps more than either of those, the particular calibration of a fully trained Culexus and the specific way their individual genetic expression of the pariah gene interacts with the modifications they have received and the mental conditioning they have undergone is something that cannot be replicated. Each operative is, in a meaningful sense, a one-of-a-kind weapon, not interchangeable parts in a production line, but individual instruments, each tuned slightly differently, each with their own operational profile. The Culexus Temple apparently accounts for this, given what various sources hint about their care in the handling of active operatives. Where the Eversaw Temple, by contrast, essentially produces disposable weapons who are expected to die on most missions, the Culexus Temple invests too much in each operative to treat them carelessly. Missions are planned with survival as a genuine goal, not an afterthought. The custodian system exists partly to manage operational risk, as well as to handle the animus speculum's secondary functions. And the strict confinement to the fortress of the soulless between missions is not purely about preventing disruption to the Imperium's psychic infrastructure. It is also about protecting a very limited and very valuable resource. The final stage of training, before an operative is considered ready for their first deployment, involves something the Temple calls confirmation. The exact nature of the confirmation process is, like most things about the Culexus Temple, not publicly documented. What can be inferred from context is that it involves a demonstration of the operative's ability to control their null aura with sufficient precision for field operations, likely tested in simulated mission conditions. Whether it also involves some form of psychological assessment, some evaluation of whether the individual can be trusted to follow mission parameters when alone and unobserved, is not documented. But given the Temple's apparent care with its operatives, it would be surprising if some form of assessment were not present. Part 7. The Arsenal of the Anathema. Weapons made of nothing. Now, let us talk about what a Culexus assassin actually carries into the field. And I want to be clear that the most important weapon they carry is not an object. The most important thing they bring to the fight is what they are. But they don't rely on that alone. The first and most immediately recognizable piece of Culexus equipment is the animus speculum. This, is the helmet. And the thing that makes the visual design of a Culexus assassin so immediately and viscerally distinctive, that grotesque facepiece with its single large cyclopean lens, that artificial eye that stares out of the center of the faceplate like something out of a nightmare. The animus speculum is named from Latin and roughly translates as mirror of the soul, which is bitterly ironic given that the person wearing it has none. The animus speculum is, at its heart, a focusing device. Its primary function is to capture the ambient psychic energy that the Culexus assassin's own null aura is constantly stripping away from nearby psychers and the surrounding environment, and concentrate it into a directed blast. Think of it like a lens for anti-light, if that makes any sense. The blank drains psychic energy from the area around them. Normally that energy just disperses, harmlessly pulled into the void. The animus speculum intercepts it, holds it in a kind of resonant matrix, and then, on the assassin's command, releases it in a focused beam of negative psychic force. Not the positive psychic energy of a psyker's fireball, the opposite, a bolt of anti-warp, a concentrated dose of the same absence that makes the Culexus so terrifying to psychic entities. The effect on a psyker that takes a direct hit from the animus speculum's discharge is, in a word, catastrophic. Weak psykers can be killed outright. The sudden influx of anti-psychic energy, the forcible severing of their warp connection, is a shock their minds cannot survive. Stronger psykers can survive the hit, but find their abilities completely suppressed, their psychic senses shut down, their reserves drained. Yet they are left, at least temporarily, as ordinary humans, stripped of the advantage that has defined their entire identity, facing an assassin in close quarters with nothing but their suddenly very frail physical form. The weapon also becomes more powerful as the engagement continues. More psykers in the vicinity means more ambient psychic energy being stripped away by the Culexus's null aura. More energy stripped away means more fuel for the animus speculum. The weapon feeds on the very thing that makes the Culexus's enemies strong. It turns their strength into its own ammunition. In a large battle against psychic-heavy forces, a Culexus assassin becomes progressively more lethal as the fight goes on, each psyker in range, both suffering from the null aura and contributing energy to the weapon that will be turned against them. There is also a secondary function. The animus speculum can, when not discharging, modulate the Culexus's own null aura, either damping it to allow the assassin to move without triggering immediate alarm, or amplifying it to maximize the terrifying effect on nearby psychic entities. This is the contra-psychic damper function mentioned in the lore. When the dampers are active, the assassin moves more quietly, their aura reduced. When they reverse them, the full force of their nature is unleashed, and every psyker in a significant radius knows immediately and viscerally that something terrible is here, something they cannot fight with the only tools they have, and the panic that follows this realization is itself a weapon. The second major piece of equipment is the Imperium. This is integrated into the Culexus assassin's sinskin body glove, woven into the garment itself as a nodal layer. The Imperium is a technology designed to amplify and extend the natural cognitive disruption that a blank causes in anyone nearby. It generates a field of distortion that reaches into the non-psychic senses as well, layering additional confusion over the already destabilized perceptions of anyone looking at or listening for the Culexus operative. The result is an assassin who is not only psychically invisible to warp-sensitive entities, but is physically, cognitively difficult to target for everyone else as well. Anyone attempting to aim at a Culexus assassin under the Imperium's influence is fighting against their own perceptions. Their eyes keep sliding away. Their aim estimates are subtly wrong. Their instincts, which normally serve soldiers well, are actively being fed bad information by a device designed specifically to scramble them. In game terms, the Imperium has historically been represented as forcing attackers to use the lowest possible weapon skill and ballistic skill values. essentially making the Culexus extremely hard to hit, regardless of the attacker's normal proficiency. In lore terms, what this means is that a Culexus operative in the field is functionally difficult to engage. Not invulnerable, because nothing in 40k is truly invulnerable, but presenting a targeting problem that cannot be resolved through skill alone. You can throw lots of attacks at them, make it statistical. You can use weapons that don't require precise targeting. But the experienced fighter pointing their gun at a Culexus and trusting their trained reflexes to handle the rest will be surprised by how often their trained reflexes fail them. The third piece of the arsenal is the force matrix. This is a less discussed component, often overshadowed by the more dramatic equipment, but fascinating in its own right. The force matrix is crafted from a material similar to that used in force weapons, those rare and devastating armaments designed to be wielded by psykers and enhanced by their warp connection. What the force matrix does is act as a passive collector of what might be called waste psychic energy. When psykers use their powers, they are rarely perfectly efficient. They draw more warp energy than they actually convert into effects, and the excess dissipates into the surrounding space. The force matrix collects this dissipated energy and stores it, providing the Culexus with a reservoir of psychic power that they, unable to channel the warp themselves, can then direct through their equipment. The closer a Culexus gets to active psykers, the more the force matrix collects. It is a feedback loop of predator and prey, the Culexus growing stronger precisely in the environments where their enemies are most numerous and most powerful. Finally, the psych-out grenades. These are among the most restricted weapons in the entire Imperium, used only by the Culexus Temple and by demon hunters of the Ordo Malleus. Each psych-out grenade contains a pressurized canister of psi-refractive dust, particles said to be collected from a metabolic byproduct of the Golden Throne itself. The working of the Golden Throne is that vast and terrible device sustaining the Emperor's body, while he feeds the Astronomicon, produces a small quantity of negatively charged psychic material as a side effect, and this material is, apparently, harvested, processed, loaded into grenades. When the grenade detonates, the dust billows outward in a crackling cloud. For ordinary beings, this is profoundly disorienting, driving conscious thought out of the mind for a moment, leaving nothing but raw animal panic. For psykers, the effect is far worse. The dust interacts directly with psychic ability, fracturing it, turning the power inward, causing a feedback loop that tears into the psyker's psyche with all the force of their own power turned against them. It is, by all accounts, agonizing. And because the material is sourced from the Golden Throne, from the Emperor's own domain, there is a theological dimension to this, that the Culexus Temple is unlikely to advertise, but that probably has not escaped the notice of the more mystically inclined among the Imperium's leadership. Part 8. On the Hunt. How a Culexus operates. What does it actually look like when a Culexus assassin is deployed? What is the experience of the mission, from insertion to termination? The first thing to understand is that a Culexus is not sent against ordinary targets. The Officio Assassinorum has other instruments for that. The Vindicar shoots world leaders through the eye from a rooftop kilometers away. The Calidus replaces key figures, inhabiting their lives and their bodies for months before striking from within. The Eversaw is more or less a directed explosion given human form, a chemical bomb shaped like a person and pointed at a room full of enemies. The Venom poisons things with patience and precision. These are powerful tools for powerful problems. The Culexus is called in when the target is psychically active and dangerous enough that the other approaches won't work. When a Chaos Sorcerer has surrounded themselves with demonic guardians who can detect and respond to psychic or material threats in ways that defeat conventional infiltration. When an Aeldari Warlock is using Farsight abilities to read the fates of those approaching them, seeing the Vindicar's bullet before it leaves the barrel and simply not being in its path when it arrives. When a rogue psyker has grown powerful enough that their reality-warping abilities make the approaches of other assassins observable and dangerous. Yes, these are the situations where the Culexus is deployed. Not because the target is the most politically significant enemy, but because the target's specific capabilities create a problem that only the Culexus can solve. The insertion is typically handled with extraordinary secrecy, even by Assassinorum standards. The custodian, that senior official who accompanies and manages the Culexus operative, will travel with the assassin under whatever cover the mission logistics support. The Culexus themselves may travel in some form of stasis or containment that minimizes the effect of their null aura on the crew of the transport. Getting a blank into close proximity to a ship full of people is a process that requires planning. Even with their aura partially suppressed, but the effect on a ship's crew during a long journey can be significantly destabilizing. Once in the field, near the target location, the custodian releases the assassin. The animus speculum's dampers are active. The null aura is reduced, and the Culexus moves. What this looks like in practice is something close to a ghost. Guards at their posts feel vaguely uneasy, but don't know why. Security systems may behave strangely, their automated functions producing slightly wrong assessments of the space they're monitoring, the Imperium creating interference that the machines cannot contextualize. Psychic wards and alarm systems, those spells and rituals that psychers place to warn of dangerous presences, detect nothing. There is nothing to detect. The Culexus has no psychic presence. The wards are looking for something that isn't there. This is perhaps the most remarkable tactical aspect of a Culexus deployment. The conventional defenses against assassination are, to a significant extent, built around the assumption that the assassin is there, that they have a soul, that they leave traces in the warp the way all living things do. Security protocols for psycho-protected facilities involve psychic scanning, demonic guardians posted to detect approaching souls, wards attuned to hostile intentions. Against a Calidus who has disguised themselves as a member of the household, or against a Vindicar observing from distance, these measures have at least some effectiveness. Against a Culexus, they are simply not applicable. The Culexus is the attack vector that the defenders have not thought to defend against, because defending against it means defending against nothing, against absence, against a hole in the universe shaped like a person. Historical records describe a particularly illuminating example. A Culexus assassin was once deployed against a chaos sorcerer, identified only as Xantaka in the records, who had surrounded himself with protective demon armies and the elite Rubrici warriors of the Thousand Suns, those walking suits of armor animated by the trapped souls of sorcerers reduced to dust. The Rubrici have no living occupants in the physical sense. Their loyalties and their perceptions are oriented through psychic means. Against them, the Culexus's null aura was essentially a sight blocker. The Rubrici could not perceive the approaching assassin. The demonic guardians, those entities of pure warp stuff, could not sense a soul approaching because there was no soul to sense. The sorcerer himself, Xantaka, presumably had wards and detection spells of exceptional power, built over years of practice. The Culexus assassin identified as Draenos walked through all of this as if it were not there. And then the animus speculum opened, and Xantaka died. That is the essential Culexus operation in its most elegant form. Not a fight, not a sustained engagement, a patient approach through defenses that cannot see it, and then a surgical removal of the target before the target's companions have processed what has happened. This is why the Culexus has historically been described as the deadliest operative available for specific, narrow mission parameters. Not because they can take on armies, they cannot. Despite their impressive individual capabilities, and a sustained battle against conventional forces will eventually end badly for a Culexus, because their advantages don't protect them from template weapons, from enough bodies in enough directions, from opponents who cannot be psychically disrupted because they have nothing to disrupt. One Culexus against a mob of ordinary humans with enough courage is not an easy fight, but one Culexus against a psyker surrounded by layers of psychic defense is an almost certain death sentence for the psyker. There is one additional aspect of Culexus operations that sits at the philosophical edge of their role. When a Culexus assassin kills a psyker at close range, with the null aura fully extended and the animus speculum actively feeding on the target's energy, the death is not clean in the warp sense. For most beings, death releases the soul into whatever passage awaits it in the Imperium. For humans in the 41st millennium, the fate of souls after death is complicated and dark, but there is at least a process. For Aeldari, the spirit stone captures the soul to preserve it from Slaanesh. For daemons, death in the material world simply returns them to the warp. When a Culexus kills, the null aura interferes with all of this. The psychic energy that would normally flow somewhere, that would transition through whatever mechanism governs post-death existence in the 40,000 universe, finds itself caught in the blank's void. Not captured in any useful sense, simply prevented from going anywhere. The soul equivalent of the target doesn't travel to the warp. It simply ceases. Snuffed out not by the warp's violence, but by the warp's complete absence. The Aeldari, who fear soul death above nearly all other fates, regard this as the worst possible ending, worse than being consumed by Slaanesh, worse than eternal torment, because at least those things imply continued existence, however terrible. What the Culexus delivers is a termination so complete that the warp itself registers nothing where the target used to be. There is one additional aspect of Culexus operations that sits at the philosophical edge of their role. When a Culexus assassin kills a psyker at close range, with the null aura fully extended and the animus speculum actively feeding on the target's energy, the death is not clean in the warp sense. For most beings, death releases the soul into whatever passage awaits it in the Imperium. For humans in the 41st millennium, the fate of souls after death is complicated and dark. But there is at least a process. For Aeldari, the spirit stone captures the soul to preserve it from Slaanesh. For demons, death in the material world simply returns them to the warp. When a Culexus kills, the null aura interferes with all of this. The psychic energy that would normally flow somewhere, that would transition through whatever mechanism governs post-death existence in the 40,000 universe, finds itself caught in the blank's void, not captured in any useful sense, simply prevented from going anywhere. The soul equivalent of the target doesn't travel to the warp, it simply ceases, snuffed out not by the warp's violence, but by the warp's complete absence. The Aeldari, who fear soul death above nearly all other fates, regard this as the worst possible ending, worse than being consumed by Slaanesh, worse than eternal torment, because at least those things imply continued existence, however terrible. What the Culexus delivers is a termination so complete that the warp itself registers nothing where the target used to be. This is what the Aeldari warlocks mean when they call the Culexus embodiments of pure evil. Not moral evil, necessarily. The Culexus doesn't care about your soul's fate. It cannot feel satisfaction at the spiritual annihilation it causes. But what it represents, to beings who understand the warp's stakes, is something that transcends conventional violence. A Culexus kill doesn't just end the physical life, it ends everything. There is one more thing worth saying about the operational reality of deploying a Culexus. The relationship between the assassin and their custodian is something the lore touches on without fully exploring. And it is worth thinking about, because the custodian is, in a fundamental sense, the Culexus's point of contact with the world they're operating in. The person who handles the practical logistics. The one who can go into environments where a blank would cause immediate disruption. The one who communicates with local forces if any communication is necessary, who negotiates access to transit routes, who manages the identity cover. The custodian is the interface between the Culexus and the wider Imperium. They are, in some ways, more essential to the mission than they usually receive credit for. They are also the closest thing to human connection that a Culexus assassin has during a deployment, which in the context of what we've discussed about the blank's social isolation, about the history of rejection and marginalization that most blanks carry, is significant. The custodian is there. They are aware of the assassin. They are, by the nature of their role, committed to the assassin's survival and function. They work alongside them in the peculiar intimacy of shared operational purpose. Whether that relationship transcends the functional, whether it becomes something that either party would describe as meaningful in a personal sense, the records do not say. But the law's careful mention of custodians, the way they appear in multiple accounts as a structural element rather than an afterthought, suggests the temple recognizes their importance beyond the mechanical management of the animus speculum's functions. After the mission, and the custodian presumably returns to their own role in the Officio Assassinorum's hierarchy, the assassin returns to the fortress of the soulless. The connection, whatever it was, is interrupted until the next deployment, and the Culexus waits, on their dead moon, in the company of others who share their condition, for the moment when the Imperium needs that particular void again. Part 9. Notable figures and historical operations. Names in the dark. Given the extreme secrecy that surrounds the Culexus temple, named operatives and documented missions are rare. What we have are fragments, glimpses, but even those glimpses are extraordinary. The first name we have is the one we began with, Sire Culexus, the founder, the first director primus of the Culexus clade, a person who carried the pariah gene and chose to build something from it, or who was guided to build something from it by Malcador the Sigillite and the Emperor's unseen hand. What Sire Culexus was like as a person, what they thought about what they were creating, whether they took satisfaction in it or felt the same quiet sadness that runs through the entire history of those born to the pariah gene, we cannot know. The records don't speak to personality, only to oaths sworn and institutions built. Then there is Iota, a name that appears in the lore of the Horus heresy, specifically in James Swallow's novel Nemesis, which is among the most detailed fictional explorations of the Officio Assassinorum ever written. Iota was a female Culexus operative, notable for being a replica, a clone, one of the laboratory-grown blanks rather than a naturally born one. She was part of the first execution force ever assembled. Just that desperate attempt by Malcador to kill Horus by sending assassins from all the major clades in a joint operation to Dagonet. The Horus heresy was a period of extraordinary darkness for the Officio Assassinorum. 8 operatives were dispatched in the attempt to kill Horus, drawn from across the clades, working together in a way that was essentially unprecedented. And they failed. Not all of them died in the attempt, but the mission was a failure. Horus proved unreachable, and the operatives on Dagonet found themselves facing not only the challenge of killing the War Master, but something else. Spear, the Black Pariah. Of all the esoteric horrors in 40K lore, and there are many, the Black Pariah occupies a uniquely disturbing niche. Spear was an experiment, a creation of the Culexus clade itself, and in an attempt to push the boundaries of what the pariah gene could be made to do. The goal was something that could kill psychers without the animus speculum, without any external equipment at all. A blank so powerful, so refined, that their mere presence was lethal to psychic targets. The Black Pariah Project. The result, in Spear's case, was something that worked, in a manner of speaking. He was extraordinarily powerful, but the combination of his augmentations and his original nature produced an instability that the clade could not control. He was deemed too dangerous to maintain, scheduled for disposal, placed on a Sisters of Silence vessel to be sent into the heart of a star. A very final solution. The vessel was intercepted. Erebus of the Wordbearers, perhaps the single most narratively important manipulator in the Horus heresy, recognized what Spear was and what he could be used for. And what followed was one of the stranger moments in the heresy's history. Erebus performed a ritual to bond a demon to Spear's body, which should not have been possible. A blank is the antithesis of everything a demon is. They should be mutually exclusive. The fact that it worked at all, that the combination held together as a functioning entity, speaks to the kind of extreme circumstances and warp-adjacent experimentation that characterized the heresy's darkest chapters. Spear became something new, something that carried both the null quality of a blank and the demon's capability to reflect psychic energy back at its source, a weapon that turned power against those who wielded it. Iota encountered Spear during the mission, recognizing him as a corrupted version of what she was. But the confrontation was personal in a way that few other events in the lore are. A Culexus operative, created to be a weapon in service to the Emperor, facing a version of herself twisted into a weapon against the Emperor. Iota fought him. She used her animus speculum, everything she had. She came close. But Spear, having absorbed a drop of her blood through his demon-enhanced abilities, was able to turn her own power against her. She died of it, killed by the reflection of what she was. The records note her death without sentiment, because that is how the Officio Assassinorum tends to note deaths. She served. She fell. The mission continued. Moving through the centuries, to the 32nd millennium, there is the operation known as a ghost amongst devils, or a designation that appears in historical records with the poetic specificity that Imperial archivists apparently reserved for the most dramatic operations. A Culexus assassin identified as Draenos was deployed against the chaos sorcerer Xantaka, who had been summoning demonic legions with increasing frequency and whose continued existence was becoming a strategic problem. The details are sparse. What the records tell us is that Draenos moved through the combined protection of Xantaka's demon armies, through his Rubriki bodyguard, through whatever personal psychic defenses the sorcerer maintained, and killed him. The demon armies, unable to perceive the approaching blank, were useless. The Rubriki, their perceptions oriented through psychic means, were blind to a being who had no soul signature. The sorcerer, for all his power, was alone in a room with a Culexus when the moment came. A ghost amongst devils. It's a good name for it. Then there is the Blinded Seer, an event recorded in the mid-34th millennium. A Culexus assassin was dispatched to kill Farseer Lithandros Esmanthil. The Farseer, an Aeldari seer of considerable ability, apparently sensed the threat, perceived through foresight that something was coming, but could not identify it. The thread in the skein of fate that corresponded to the approaching Culexus was simply absent. The Farseer kept looking for it, kept scrying forward through possible futures, and found every path converging on a danger that had no face, no identity, no psychic signature. The records describe the Farseer's increasing alarm as attempts to locate the pursuer kept failing, running, relocating. I know desperate attempts to buy time by being somewhere other than where the foresight said was dangerous, only to find that foresight useless, because you cannot navigate around a threat that exists as pure physical presence with no warp echo. Eventually, the Farseer was simply exhausted. The Culexus, patient, unhurried, occupying the physical world with absolute certainty, closed the distance. And then there is the matter of Farseer Aladrios Colcassian of Craftworld Alaitok. This is one of the most remarkable indirect stories in the entire Culexus lore, and it speaks volumes about what the temple represents even to those who never face it directly. The story goes that a Culexus assassin killed Colcassian's sister, who was also a Farseer. For the Aeldari, as I mentioned, death at the hands of a Culexus is the worst of all possible deaths. The soul is not taken by Slanesh. It does not rest in a spirit stone. It simply ends. And this ending, for a species that has built an entire civilization around the preservation of souls and the desperate protection of every individual against the Chaos God who hungers for Aeldari essence, is something beyond grief, something beyond tragedy. It is the final refusal of meaning. Colcassian spent centuries tracking the fortress of the soulless, centuries of patient, methodical intelligence gathering, of farsight sessions studying every possible future path that might lead to the temple's location, of operatives dispatched and resources spent in pursuit of something that, by its very nature, has no warp signature to follow. He found it. Somehow, through means the records don't explain, he found the dead moon, the fortress, at the location of the most heavily protected secret in Assassinorum history. He dispatched an Aeldari Shadow-class cruiser, the legacy of Eldanesh, to destroy it. And then he looked forward, into the skeins of fate, with all the considerable power of a senior Elitok Farseer. He looked at what came after the temple's destruction, and in every future he could see, in every probability, in every thread, the destruction of the Culexus temple was followed by the annihilation of Craftworld Elitok itself, not attacked by the Imperium, presumably. Something else. Something that the Culexus temple, in its silent existence, was apparently preventing. Without the temple, without whatever function those soulless inhabitants of that dead moon served in the vast, centuries-spanning game of cause and effect that runs through the 40,000 universe, our Alatok was destroyed. He recalled the cruiser. He left the temple standing, and he lived, presumably, with that knowledge for the rest of his very long Farseer life, that the thing which killed his sister was allowed to continue existing because the alternative was worse. Because the universe is built in ways that even the best foresight cannot untangle, and sometimes the only choice is between two kinds of grief. Part 10. Enemies of the Psychic Galaxy. The Culexus as counter. Let us survey the enemies. Let us take each of the psychically active major factions of the 40K universe and consider what facing a Culexus assassin means for them specifically. Because each case is different, and each difference illuminates something about what the Culexus actually is: chaos. This is where the Culexus temple most frequently operates, and where their advantages are most complete. Chaos, by its nature, is a psychic phenomenon. The Chaos Gods are entities of the warp. Their servants, the Chaos Sorcerers, and the Demon Princes, and the entities that have been transformed through long service to the Dark Powers, all of them maintain a connection to the Imperium that is both their strength and their vulnerability to a blank's influence. The Chaos Space Marines who have survived centuries in the Eye of Terror, who have twisted their genetics and their souls through devotion to the ruinous powers, they are deeply invested in the warp in ways that ordinary humans are not. They are more dependent on it, more shaped by it, and when the Culexus's null aura reaches them, it reaches into something that has grown far more essential to who and what they are. And for the Sorcerers of the Thousand Suns, the most psychically invested of all the Chaos Legions, a Culexus assassin is a specific nightmare. An entire legion built around psychic ability, around the refinement and expression of warp powers, around the identity of the sorcerer warrior. Their greatest figures have mastered arts that should make them essentially untouchable by conventional means. And then one soulless person walks through their carefully constructed defenses and dismantles what they are. The demonic hosts are, as noted, essentially blind to a Culexus. They perceive the world primarily through the warp's lens. They hunt souls. A being without a soul, emitting no warmth, no fear, no psychic trace of any kind, is invisible to them in the most fundamental sense. Demon armies can be walked through, not fought, necessarily. Certainly not if the Culexus is somehow noticed by physical means. But if the task is to reach a target through a room full of demons, the Culexus is the only operative who can do this without triggering immediate response. The Aeldari. Every Aeldari is, to some degree, psychically active. Their species exists in a state of heightened warp sensitivity that makes their craft world elders among the most powerful seers in the galaxy. For them, a blank is not just uncomfortable in the way it is for ordinary humans. It is a perceptual violation. The Aeldari sense the world through a combination of physical and psychic awareness, and the blank creates a gap in that awareness, a void that cannot be filled, a presence that appears only as an absence. The Warlocks and Farseers, those Aeldari who have pushed deepest into psychic mastery, feel this most severely. The null aura of a Culexus at close range can be physically incapacitating for an Aeldari psyker. Painful, disorienting, a blinding of the senses they rely on most. This is why the Aeldari, in the lore, treat the Culexus with a specific and distinctive horror that goes beyond ordinary tactical concern. Other Imperial assassins they can read, detect, anticipate. Their foresight is effective against most threats, because most threats exist in the warp's mirror. A Culexus doesn't exist there. It exists only in the physical, and the physical is the one domain where Aeldari foresight offers less advantage. Culcassian's story is not unique in kind, only in scale. The Aeldari fear the Culexus temple with the specific, helpless fear of people who have run out of the tool they rely on most, the Tyranids. Oh, this is interesting because the Tyranids are not, in the conventional sense, warp-based entities. They don't commune with chaos. They don't have the same kind of soul connection that most psychic races have. And yet the hive mind, that collective consciousness that connects every Tyranid organism in a fleet, that makes billions of individually mindless creatures into a single coordinated intelligence, that connection functions through a form of psychic communion. The synapse creatures, the hive tyrants and zoanthropes, and the others who serve as psychic relay nodes for the hive mind, these creatures are psychically active in ways that leave them vulnerable to blank influence. And the communications web itself, the psychic thread that holds the swarm together, can be disrupted by a strong enough null aura. Isolated Tyranid creatures cut off from synapse control become frightened, confused, directionless. The swarm stops being a swarm. A Culexus assassin in the middle of a Tyranid attack can create dead zones in the hive mind's local network, pockets of disconnected organisms, disruptions in the coordination that makes the swarm so devastatingly effective. Even a hive tyrant, one of the most powerful psychic presences in a Tyranid force, can be made to hesitate, made to doubt its own connection to the greater whole, by the proximity of a blank's void. Even the Tau, that puzzling exception to the psychic rule, that species so unremarkable in warp terms that they barely register as souls even on a good day, even they are not entirely unaffected by a Culexus. The story that gets referenced in various discussions of the lore involves a full execution force, all 4 major assassin types, sent on a mission against Tau targets. The Vindicar, the best sniper in the galaxy. The Kaleidos, the perfect infiltrator. The Eversaw, a living weapon of last resort. Each tried and failed to complete their assigned kill. The Culexus succeeded, against Tau, who don't have psychers, who have basically no warp presence at all. The story speaks to the Culexus's secondary advantage, the physical, near invisibility, conferred by the null aura even on non-psychic targets, the way the mind refuses to process the blank's existence, the way even automated systems can be confused by the Ethereum's interference. The Culexus succeeded not because of its anti-psychic capabilities, but because it is simply very, very hard to notice until it is too late. It is worth dwelling on what this tells us about the scope of the Culexus's utility. In the popular understanding of 40K strategy and lore, the Culexus is often discussed as a narrow-use instrument, an anti-psyker weapon that you deploy when the enemy has a lot of psychic capability and otherwise leave in reserve, and this is largely accurate as a tactical assessment. But the Tau example, and the various other instances in the lore where Culexus operatives have successfully targeted non-psychic entities, suggests that the aura of disregard that the blank radiates is not purely a psychic phenomenon in its effects. It works on a level that precedes conscious thought. The mind, even a non-psychic mind, even the artificial intelligence of a sensor system, encounters the blank and makes an error. What decides that what it is seeing or detecting is less significant than the data actually suggests, moves on. Whether this is a side effect of the warp's absence, a form of reality distortion caused by the blank's negation of the psychic ambient that normally informs all perception, or something else entirely, is not understood even by the Mechanicum's most dedicated researchers. The Culexus temple itself has presumably made some study of it, but whatever conclusions they have reached are not shared. The effect is real. The mechanism is mysterious. And the Imperium, characteristically, has decided that a thorough understanding of the mechanism is less important than effective deployment of the effect. Part 11. The Culexus and the wider Imperium. Fear, politics, and uncomfortable questions. There are factions within the Imperium that would see every blank executed and the Culexus temple utterly destroyed. This is not a historical oddity. This is, in the present tense of the 41st millennium, an ongoing political reality. Let's examine why. The Culexus temple is, on one level, unambiguously useful. The evidence of their value to the Imperium is not in question. Chaos sorcerers dead. Eldari farseers neutralized. Demonic hosts disrupted. Targets eliminated that no other force could reach. The military calculus is clear. This institution saves lives, in the aggregate, by surgically removing threats that would otherwise require the deaths of hundreds or thousands of soldiers to suppress by conventional means. But the nature of what the Culexus is creates political problems that cannot be resolved by pointing to the military calculus. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the vast organization that manages the Imperium's psychic infrastructure, the Astronomicon and the Black Ships, and the training of sanctioned psychers, they have an obvious institutional interest in the existence of blanks, and that interest is not uncomplicated. Large concentrations of blanks interfere with the Astronomicon, as was discovered during the Great Crusade. The Astra Telepathica's entire value to the Imperium is predicated on maintaining and operating that beacon. Anything that threatens its function is, from their perspective, a strategic problem regardless of its other qualities. The Adeptus Mechanicus, and who were the original partners of the Culexus clade in its secret founding, have a complicated relationship with the temple that has not always been amicable. In an episode somewhere in the 37th millennium, the Mechanicus apparently attempted to claim ownership of the original fortress of the soulless on Terra, that facility they had built themselves, but then technically abandoned during the fiction of the Pariah project's closure. The Officio Assassinorum's response was, characteristically, direct. The dispute was ended by a sniper's bullet, presumably delivered by a Vindicar rather than a Culexus, since the latter is not primarily a ranged weapon. But the point was made. The Assassinorum protects its own. The various ordos of the Inquisition have their own desires where blanks are concerned. The Ordo Hereticus uses blanks as acolytes, while the Ordo Malleus values them as demon suppressors. The Ordo Xenos has its own purposes. All of these compete with the Culexus Temple's recruitment pipeline for the same tiny population of available pariah gene carriers. The relationships between these competing claims are managed through arrangements that are, by definition, not publicly documented, because all parties involved operate in secrecy. What can be inferred is that the Culexus Temple, rather than being the natural final recipient of all available blanks, is one competitor among several for a resource that is never plentiful enough to satisfy anyone. And then there is the deeper discomfort, the thing that makes even people who benefit from the Culexus Temple want to look away. The Imperium of Man is, at its theological and political core, built on the concept of the soul. Yet the Emperor is a god figure not in spite of his psychic power, but because of it. The Astronomicon, the Astronomica beacon that guides the Imperium, is a psychic projection of his will. The entire apparatus of the imperial cult, the faith of billions of ordinary humans, is built on the premise that the Emperor guides and protects the souls of his people. The High Lords speak of serving the Emperor's will. The prayers of the faithful ask for his light to guide them. The concept of the soul, of the warp presence that connects living things to something larger, is fundamental to the Imperium's self-understanding. A Culexus assassin has no soul, by definition. By the same measure that the Imperium uses, they have no warp presence, no echo in the immaterium. When they die, there is nothing to protect, nothing to guide, and nothing to receive into the Emperor's grace. They are, by the framework the Imperium uses to understand human existence, not fully there. And this is not a peripheral theological problem. This is central, because if the Imperium's understanding of what makes a human being is rooted in the soul, then what is the Culexus assassin? What is the vat-grown blank who never had a biological family, who was created in a laboratory to carry this gene, who has spent their entire existence in the fortress of the soulless, who may not be capable of feeling emotions in the way that the rest of humanity does? The Imperium does not resolve this question. It cannot, without undermining either the utility of the Culexus or the theological framework that justifies the entire structure of imperial society. So it does what the Imperium typically does with uncomfortable questions. It classifies them. The Culexus temple operates in secrecy not only for operational reasons. It also operates in secrecy because its existence raises questions that the High Lords of Terror would prefer remain unasked. The Adeptus Mechanicus, for their part, have sometimes expressed the view that the Culexus assassin represents something close to their ideal of human-machine integration, a person whose human element has been stripped down to its pure functional components. No messy soul to complicate matters. No warp interference in the clean determinism of physical process. The Mechanicus has, historically, been rather more interested in studying the pariah gene than the Officio Assassinorum has been comfortable with, as the tension between these institutional perspectives has, as mentioned, occasionally been resolved with firearms. What the Culexus assassins themselves think about all of this is not documented, because the Imperium rarely thinks to ask its weapons what they prefer. What can be inferred from the fragmentary accounts and the psychology implied by the available lore is something melancholy and complex. These are people, natural or vat-grown, who carry a genetic trait that isolated them from the rest of humanity before anyone told them what it was, who have been brought into an institution that values them precisely for the quality that made them outcasts, who live on a dead moon in a fortress that the rest of the galaxy cannot find, surrounded by others who share their condition, trained to kill things that the Imperium needs dead, and then return to that fortress until the next mission. Whether they feel purpose in this, whether they feel something that functions like pride or belonging or satisfaction, we cannot say with certainty. Whether the vat-grown ones, in particular, feel anything at all in the way that most people understand feeling is left carefully ambiguous in the lore. There is a humanity there, in the natural-born ones at least, however attenuated. A history, a before. They remember what it was to be rejected before the temple took them. They carry that with them into the fortress, into the training, into the field. But there is something else worth examining here, something that sits beneath the surface of this political section and connects it back to the psychological. The Culexus temple is run not by its assassins, but by officials of the Officio Assassinorum, senior functionaries who are not themselves blanks. This is different from the structure of most assassin temples, where experienced senior assassins eventually move into leadership and training roles. At the Culexus temple, the leadership remains external. The blanks within are governed, managed, directed. They are not autonomous in the way that a Vindicare or Kalidas operative might eventually become, with years of experience translating into increasingly self-directed operational authority. This creates a subtle power dynamic that the lore doesn't discuss directly, but that is present in the structure. The beings with the greatest individual capability in the temple, whose null aura makes them capable of walking through nearly any security, are the ones with the least institutional authority. They are, on some level, the inmates of that armored fastness as much as its residents. The decision of when they are deployed and where they go rests with officials who do not share their nature, who cannot fully comprehend their experience, and who are managing them partly on behalf of an Imperium that has historically wanted blanks either dead or useful, and not much else. Whether the Culexus operatives themselves experience this as unfair, as confinement, as something they would choose to change if the choice were available, again, the records are silent. But the architecture of the relationship is worth noticing. And perhaps what they do with that memory, the thing that the Culexus temple has done in creating itself from that specific raw material, is the most interesting thing of all. They have taken the one quality that made these people suffer, the void in themselves that repelled the world, and they have made it sacred, made it the point, made it the thing that matters, the thing the Imperium needs, the thing that no one else can provide. The emptiness that drove them to the margins of human civilization is the same emptiness that walks into rooms full of demons and sorcerers and makes them afraid, makes them pause, makes them doubt. There is something almost like justice in that, and maybe something almost like a story about humanity's relationship to the things it excludes, the qualities it fears, the people it pushes to the margins, and then, when the margins turn out to be strategically valuable, reaches back for. Let me think about the name one more time. Culexus. The mosquito. A creature that approaches without announcing itself, that lands so lightly you don't feel it until it's already done what it came to do, that drains something from you, quietly, while you're looking at something else. And that is, to most people, simply a pest, something vaguely unpleasant to encounter, that you wave away without thinking too hard about. Until, in the right conditions, in the right context, it turns out to be the vector for something that can kill you. Not the mosquito itself, what the mosquito carries, what it delivers. A Culexus assassin is the mosquito. The void is what they carry, and what they deliver to the psychers and sorcerers and demonic entities of the 41st millennium is an ending, clean and absolute and immediate. As an ending that even the most powerful warp entity cannot predict, because it comes from outside the dimension where prediction happens, where foresight works, where every defense has been built. The Imperium has built many weapons. It has constructed space marine chapters with genetic lineages stretching back 10,000 years. It has launched crusades that consumed entire generations of soldiers. It has deployed titans, those god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, walking engines of destruction the size of buildings, and let them stride across worlds, killing everything that opposed them. It has used Exterminatus, the final, planet-scouring judgment that ends a world rather than lose it. And it has also built this, the smallest and the quietest. One person in a body glove, carrying a helmet, or walking through the dark towards someone who cannot see them coming. There is something clarifying about contemplating scale like this. The Imperium's power is immense, incalculable, staggering in its breadth. But at the fine points of its application, at the tip of the finest instruments it possesses, there is sometimes just one person, shaped by everything that was done to them and everything they've survived, doing something quiet that changes something enormous. Part 12. The Closing Dark. Reflections on the Rarest blade. Let me bring this back around to where we started, the fortress of the soulless, on its dead moon, orbiting nothing, sitting in the cold, beyond the Astronomican's reach, unknown in its location to almost everyone in a galaxy of uncountable billions. And inside it, now a small population of people for whom the word people comes with an asterisk. Human in genetics and origin, whatever that origin is. Human in appearance. Living, breathing, aging, dying. By whatever means they die in the end. But absent from the thing that the 40,000 universe uses to define humanity's connection to itself and to whatever passes for meaning in that setting. The Culexus assassins are not celebrated. There are no hymns to them in the Imperial Hymnarium. No space marine chapters trace their lineage to Culexus operatives. No feast days memorialize their kills. The historical record of their operations is classified beyond all but the most senior levels of the Officio Assassinorum hierarchy. Their names, if they have names in the way that most people do, are unknown to the broader Imperium. The very nature of their abilities means that the most successful Culexus operations are precisely the ones that leave the least evidence. A target dies. Whatever killed them was not perceived. The investigation concludes with a mystery. And somewhere, on a dead moon that no navigator can find, the operative is returned to the fortress, and the fortress continues its silence. There is a paragraph in the Wrath and Glory role-playing materials that describes what it is to be a Culexus assassin, and it is worth pausing on because it captures something true about what they are, even if the description is necessarily incomplete. It says, "You are anathema, witchbane, wordslayer, psychic abomination. Your foes dread your presence, desperately hoping that you are a nightmarish figment, for their minds cannot bear to acknowledge the abyss within your soul." The abyss within your soul. There it is. Not the presence of something monstrous, the absence of something expected. The abyss is not there because something evil was put there. The abyss is there because what is supposed to be present simply is not. And the universe, which has organized itself across 10,000 years of psychic development and spiritual evolution, to assume that presence cannot cope with its absence, cannot look at it directly, cannot process it without flinching. The Culexus assassins are what you get when the Imperium of man looks at the most isolated, most rejected, most socially abandoned subset of an already often desperate population and decides that the quality that made them that way can be refined into a tool. Not with cruelty, necessarily, not with malice probably, but with the same cold utility that characterizes every decision the Imperium makes about its people. You have a rare and terrible ability. We have rare and terrible problems. The mathematics resolve cleanly. What is lost in that resolution, what the mathematics do not capture, is the question of who these people might have been if they had been born into a universe with a different kind of welcome for them. Whether the child who grew up being avoided by everyone around them, who learned that their nature itself was a form of harm to those they loved, who was eventually taken to a fortress on a dead moon and trained to kill things, whether that child was given the best possible version of their life, or simply the only available version, whether there is a difference. These are questions the 41st Millennium doesn't ask, but we can ask them, here in the quiet, thinking about assassins who don't have souls and the galaxy that created them and the darkness they move through, invisible, on their way to kill things that deserve killing, and maybe some things that don't, in service to an Imperium that would just as soon not think too hard about what they are. That, in its way, is the most Warhammer 40,000 sentence I have ever said. The Culexus assassins are not the most dramatic element of the Officio Assassinorum. The Eversaw has the better action sequence. The Kaleidos has the better mystery. The Vindicar has the better shot. But the Culexus is the one that stays with you. The one that raises questions you keep turning over. The one whose lore, the more you sit with it, the more it opens up into something philosophical and strange and genuinely moving in the way that the best 40K lore always is. A void, given direction. A hole in the universe, given purpose. The absence that the galaxy needs, filling the spaces that nothing else can fill. That which is unknown and unseen always commands the greatest fear. So says the Dictatus Culexus, the maxim of the temple. And having spent this time in their story, I believe it entirely. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It was a long one, and it was meant to be. This lore deserves the space. These figures, whatever we decide to call them, whatever category we put them in, deserve the careful attention. They are, in their particular and remarkable way, among the most interesting things in the entire 40K setting. If this found something in you, as if it stirred something, please leave a comment below and tell me what you're thinking. The best part of making these videos is the conversations that come after, and this particular topic is one that I know generates a lot of different perspectives. I want to hear yours. And if you've been watching for a while and you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time. We go deep on this stuff regularly, with the same care and the same patience that we brought here tonight. The Q on 40K community is a good one, and you're very welcome in it. Like the video if it was worth your time. It means more than you might think. And until next time, keep the light of the Astronomicon close, even if there are those among us who cannot see it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.